I call Penny. Penny, how are you?
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you for this opportunity, and I rise in support of my colleague Jacinda Ardern, who's just resumed her seat. She's already mentioned, Mr. Chair, that we have a number of SOPs up at this particular stage in the bill, and we'll be talking about those as we go through the amendment bill part by part. Mr. Chair, part one, and I want to flesh out a little bit more around that particular hearing. I was a member on the Select Committee who listened to the harrowing tales from whānau who were affected by the tragedy Jacinda Ardern's just mentioned. The ability to communicate with authorities was difficult. The ability to care for their loved one in such a desperate time was really quite difficult. And to hear those stories, to be honest, Mr. Chair, actually pulled on the heartstrings and drew a bit of a tear for some of the members on the committee, because they were hard to hear, they were hard to listen to. But I guess this is the importance of this bill. We need to make sure that we get this right, and I do want to make a very brief mention about the inquiry established by the Māori Affairs Select Committee in looking at the way that the Coroners Amendment Bill, and indeed just the overall practice of dealing with and managing tūpapaku is an important thing for Māori whānau. And I think as New Zealand grows, we find there's a blend of tikanga and customs, of Māori customs, and probably more Western customs, if you like, more Christian customs anyway. So I just wanted to make a quick mention of that, because I understand that that inquiry is well underway and submissions will be heard soon. So, Mr. Chair, part one. Around the Chief Coroner's functions. The Chief Coroner's main function is to contribute to the integrity and effectiveness of coronial system provided for by this Act. My colleague Jacinda Ardern has already mentioned some of those challenges that will be faced, that we believe will come out of this particular amendment bill. And some of those are around capacity. Some of those are around making sure that there are clear processes in place so that there is a clear and coherent register, so that we actually are empowering the coroner to make sure that they're able to do their job as intended by that particular clause, Mr. Speaker, to contribute to the integrity and effectiveness of the coronial system provided for by this Act. So it says there, overseeing coroners' investigations by managing the workloads of coroners. I happen to know a couple of the coroners, Mr. Chair, who have already made mention to me on several occasions just about how stretched they are. And there was a particular recent case, a tragedy in my whānau last week, of a whānau member passing away tragically on a farm on a Sunday. And sadly, just because of the sheer workload, and of course the process from the coroner, the tūpapaku, or my relative, wasn't released back to the whānau till late Monday evening, which made things quite difficult for the whānau. But I think probably in that whole process, Mr. Chair, the most difficult thing is whānau are just left out to flounder. They don't know what's going on. They're unable to communicate meaningfully with anyone to make sure that their loved one in the care and possession of the coroner is actually cared for according to our customs, cared for in a way that we'd expect for anybody to care for those who have departed. So the reason I talk about that workload, Mr. Chair, is because further on in Clause 7, Part 2, the Chief Coroner has the following additional functions, which arguably are there to support the Chief Coroner's main function. So it says there, to establish and to help maintain relationships between coroners and other persons carrying out functions or duties within the coronial system. Now I understand that part. That's pretty clear with me. However, I think, and we'll discuss this later on in the amendment bill, sir, a bit later on, it actually defines what some of those people, who some of those people can be, and their role in the particular coronial process. It says here, to help to inform and to achieve consistency in a coronial decision-making and other coronial conduct, for example, by issuing practice notes, and to perform the functions of a head of head of bench under the Judicial Conduct Commissioner and Judicial Conduct Panel Act 2004 in relation to exercise by coroners. And D there, sir, it says to help to avoid unnecessary duplication in Mr. Chair. In investigations into deaths by liaising and encouraging coordination. And I think that's an important part, because throughout the submissions, Mr. Chair, we heard how there seemed to be a breakdown in communication far too often between authorities such as the police, the coroner themselves, the hospital or the doctor involved in the particular case, and whether or not that the point of contact with the whānau was actually the right one, or whether or not there were numerous stories being told to different people, or the same story being told to different people. And we often know how a breakdown in communication occurs when despite hearing the same story, they retell it in a different way. So I understand all that. And from the outset, sir, they look pretty practical. They look like they'll be a good way in making sure that the experience families have with the coroner is a good one considering the difficult times. However, Mr. Chair, it gets back to that issue I mentioned earlier around resourcing and capacity, actually making sure that we empower them to do the right job without forcing more roles and more responsibilities onto them, and by not supporting them to achieve their function. And I think that should be of huge concern to us, Mr. Chair. Part E there, it says to set up and maintain a register, and it goes back to what Jacinda Ardern was saying. This must be publicly available of coroners' recommendations and comments, or summaries of those recommendations and comments made after 1 July 2016. Now, we understand the need for a register. I think that's a pretty good thing. It's common sense, it's pragmatic, allows people to follow what's going on, because unless you have the unfortunate circumstance of losing somebody, you wouldn't know what the coroner does. You wouldn't know how the process works or how the system's set up. So I think it's actually quite important that you have a register there. However, Mr. Chair, more importantly, it talks about the recommendations and the comments and making sure that that's in a register, because you'll find in the SOPs by members on this side of the House, and as we debate this bill further throughout the evening, Mr. Chair, you'll find that actually we're going to get on to the recommendations from the coroners and how it reminds me of the Waitangi Tribunal. They do a fantastic job. They work considerably hard given they're under-resourced, in my opinion. They come up with great recommendations, and they seem to just fall into the nothingness or into the abyss, into the information highway that leaves everybody else behind, and nobody actually sees or understands what these recommendations mean and how important they are to a particular industry. And we heard some submissions throughout the time on the Select Committee, Mr. Chair, about the forestry industry, and how the forestry industry, we know the appalling record of health and safety in the forestry industry. We heard about, and we spoke to, the members on this side of the House spoke to some of the whānau victims from the forestry industry, and we were really, really concerned about, well, how do we fix this? Do some recommendations or do pragmatic steps put in place? Will it be able to fix this? But it means nothing, Mr. Chair, if once again, like the Waitangi Tribunal, it's a lion with no teeth. Mr. Chair, I know my time's short, coming up short here. In Section 9, replace the definition of Chief Coroner with Chief Coroner means the person appointed under Section 105 and includes either of the following people while he or she is authorised to act for the Chief Coroner under Section 105A or 106, the Deputy Chief Coroner and the Acting Chief Coroner. And I think that's, given the some of the discussions from the coroner who come in front of the Select Committee, I think it's important to have roles of delegation, because they talked about how stretched they were. They talked about how it was difficult to actually feel that you could go on and have a bit of a break and get the break that you need to make sure that you do your job properly, given just the huge workload. And in their absence, it's important that we have those, those particular roles delegated, Mr. Chair. So just in closing, for my contribution in this particular part. You'll see that some of the SOPs coming in will make, I think, some real pragmatic changes to this bill, and we'll be looking forward to moving on to the next parts, Mr. Chair.
I call David Clendon.